Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachael Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started. Well, we're back here in this season of Advent. You'll likely, some of you, be hearing this the Saturday before the third Sunday of Advent. And as I mentioned, in this particular season, I have the privilege of inviting some friends and people I'm learning from, just really good conversation partners in this season. And so today I am joined by Cole Arthur Riley. Hi, Cole.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Cole is the founder and writer of Black Liturgies, which you can find at blackliturgies.com. You can also find her on Instagram at Black Liturgies. She is a friend of mine. She is, I think, a brilliant writer, an incredible liturgist. She's a speaker. She also works as the content and spiritual formation manager at Chesterton House, which is a Center for Christian Studies at Cornell University. So she works a lot with college students and their spiritual formation. And so I just thought, oh man, I want to have a conversation with Cole about Advent because I want to hear from you about it. And I want our audience to get to encounter some of your incredible artistic, poetic, really embodied liturgies and thoughts. So thank you for coming along on this journey with me.
Thank you.
Before we kind of jump into reflecting more on the Advent season, which I know for many people is not necessarily a practice that they've had in their spiritual formation. But first, before we go there, I want to hear a little bit more from you. Tell me about the creation of Black Liturgies, which I know is still pretty new in its endeavor, and yet is striking a chord with so many people. How did this come to be a way you were expressing your prayers, your poetry, your thoughts?
Mm-hmm. Right. It's actually really kind of lovely that we're talking about Black Liturgies as we're thinking about Advent, because I definitely think Black Liturgies was birthed out of a lot of tragedy and longing and even a little bit of my soul being on the brink of despair. I began it in the wake of the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and the resurfacing of the unjust murders of Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain. And I just found my soul, my body longing for something in the liturgies I was engaging with, either morning prayer. I'm confirmed in the Episcopal Church, either through morning prayer or, Eucharist services or things like that. I was longing to see my Blackness and my story in a way that it just felt the liturgies written by white men weren't capable of speaking to. And so I thought, I'll try to start this thing called Black Liturgies and have it be, I had already been doing some written, writing of prayers and short, litanies and things like that. Maybe it's time to make this public, to have this be something that's shared in community. And maybe it could be something that keeps other people from despair.
Yeah, I mean, I've told you this before, that your generosity and courage to, in some ways, you're just very embodied liturgies are such a gift, I know, to the Black community and to many more people. And one of my mentors and friends, Jen Oyama Murphy, recently was speaking about the need for more harmony. And since I see that a different centering of a different embodied experience in a liturgical expression as kind of contending with a single melody that is not inherently bad in the sense of like, oh, that's bad, we don't need that, but has been too isolated and projected as the central frame for every human. And that's just not true. And so grateful for the voice and the invitation that you're bringing in your work. And you are an incredible writer. And I know you've even the way you talk about yourself in your bio is so stunning. And so I love that you are getting to bring your writing in a public way, in such a way that gives so much life back to you. At least I hope it does. And that
it
kind
does.
of growing of community.
Absolutely.
Well, maybe you could talk a little bit more about like, what is liturgy? For those of us who didn't grow up hearing a word like that or encountering more formal liturgy, like how do you understand the role and function of liturgy? What does that mean?
I didn't grow up with a liturgical background or even a Christian spiritual background overtly. And so, but much of what I've learned of liturgy and experienced of liturgy has been in Episcopal and Anglican settings. And so I'll speak out of that. I think liturgy contains prayer. It certainly has elements of prayer in it, but I think of it more as a habit of being with God that then shapes other habits that you have. Whenever I first started to attend an Episcopal church, I remember just being so struck by the beauty of the words, but the actual practices of the liturgy, I was just like, this is exhausting. We're standing, we're sitting, we're kneeling, we're standing. And it's a very sensory experience. A lot of people think of it as merely words, but it is a very embodied experience. Everything from the colors to the smells, if incense is used in the services that you attend, to this like ongoing communal gesturing of things and the moving of the word of scripture. Everything is very embodied and very sensory. And so I think of liturgy as that. And so when I thought about creating Black Liturgies, I knew I wanted a space that always contains some element of a written prayer, something that words that people could share across space and hopefully time to some extent. But also I wanted the colors to be a balm. I wanted I've had to really think through what kind of font am I using to make this an inclusive and healing experience for people, and also what are who are other voices and thinkers that I can merge with the, overtly spiritual to say, these are people that might not even profess the same spirituality as I do, but they are forming me, and they, I'm allowing them to have space in my liturgies. I'm choosing, I want you to form me in my prayer, and I want how you form me to be connected with my prayer life. So yeah, liturgies, it's a bit, I do think it's mysterious to some degree. We can try to put words to it, but there's also just kind of a being with God in the habit of liturgy that I think is, it's hard to put words to.
Yeah. There's also something I love that it's a being with God, and especially in the way you're offering it, it's a being with God in community, being formed by practices, being formed together. And, we're going to talk about Advent. We're going to talk about what it means that we're anticipating this story of God that we live into every year in these liturgical rhythms, the beginning of a new storied year, right? Because Advent kicks off the liturgical year. We journey through these different stories of Jesus to remember, to reflect, to be transformed. And I also think, because we're going to be talking about something that has to do with God being embodied, there's something about liturgy, I think good liturgy, that is coming from an embodiment and with particularity. And I think part of what you're saying is there's been a more dominant voice that gets to dictate what that embodied experience is.
Yes.
And we need to dismantle that, not destroy it, but dismantle it. And sometimes it does need to be contended with in a prophetic way, in that embodied prophetic way. And so, yeah. With that, I do want to hear from you as a liturgist, as a Black woman, in this season where despair feels more thick in so many collective ways, in the midst of a global pandemic, in the midst of racialized trauma and injustice that continues to be amplified and exposed, in the midst of economic disparities that are growing. And I think just the continued election anxiety and disruption and kind of, I would say, chaos. And so, one, I want to hear your thoughts on Advent, but I also want to hear, how are you approaching this season that invites us to get into our bodies at such a time as this?
Yes. I've loved Advent since the day I learned about it. And the beauty of liturgy is it very intentionally makes room for different emotions and different seasons of life. And so for me, I'm a person who has always been given toward more solemnness than excitement. And I think Advent has been really healing for me because it's allowed my sadness and fears to breathe in a season that is typically marked by a lot of cheer. Not that there's anything wrong with cheer, but there's something really healing about having my sadness met with anticipation, and not always excitement. That was good for my soul and story. And I absolutely think that as a Black woman, Advent can be such a harbor for the laments of our lives, the laments of our current circumstances, and in the wake of this election and all that it's stirred up, and all of the memories and things that we've had to face in new ways and to watch other people face. It's a time to pay attention to our bodies, and Advent. I mean, it's the time in the liturgical calendar. Certainly there are others, but the origins of Advent are the body of a woman. Like, it is the womb of a woman, and her paying attention to her body, and a promise being spoken over what she was capable of doing and what she would ultimately do and give in order to birth something good and healing. So I think even that Advent originates there, in our bellies, is so special to me.
God, I almost find myself getting teary-eyed, which has been happening a lot on the podcast. So I think people are probably maybe worried about me. I really am doing okay. There's just something really powerful about this Christian story that I think sometimes we actually are afraid to get close to, because there is a radical upending of how we imagine power, how we imagine God's rescue. I mean, we're talking about a story where God embodies in such vulnerability to entrust God's self to the womb of a human woman.
Yes.
And that is like, we were talking before we started recording about the kind of, you were pondering about the faith, the mutual faith of God, at least in Mary, but I'd like to think as a picture of a greater faith in humanity. That is pretty mind-blowing.
It is that God would put his faith in a woman, put his faith in us, that we would sustain him, that we would protect his little baby body, that we would love and be tender to him, to feed and clothe him. It's absolutely subversive and beautiful that in our faith tradition we have a God who has faith in us, just as he asks us to have faith in him. And yeah, it's humility, it's mutuality, and it's also, just beauty, like a beautiful kind of form of interdependence and reliance and trust. And that image of like bodily trust, a woman trusting her body, and then the maker of the cosmos trusting a woman's body, like that is the story we need right now, right? As all of this chaos and ugliness is being laid bare in our country. Yeah.
Oh, and I mean, massive distrust in each other, and kind of a sense of how where is God in our midst, and a great need for God. And we hold this story, Mary is a marginalized woman in her culture. And we see that even in the birth story, the ways in which her locatedness, her and Joseph's locatedness, will leave them giving birth to the God of the cosmos in a stable, like in a barn.
Yeah.
Fleeing violence of the empire because of the threat of even just the prophecies of this God child. And the text of this particular, because for those of you that aren't familiar with liturgical rhythms and seasons, there are texts that are assigned to these different Sundays of Advent. And this coming Sunday's texts are Isaiah 61, which Jesus will refer to in Luke when he announces, like, this is my ministry. This is what I'm called to, this language. The Spirit of the Lord God has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to set captives free, and to, this kind of radical language of to turn your ashes into beauty, and, your mourning into dancing. And it also, the text associated with this coming week is Mary's song.
Yes.
That we find in Luke, that she utters, this again, reversal of how we identify the ways we think God will show up in power. She's naming some pretty profound truths. And when I think about what that invites us to, I'm not quite sure it necessarily like soothes my despair. I think it invites me to lean into a different kind of risk.
Yeah, it does something to me whenever I read Mary's song. And for so long, I've thought of it as kind of this, I don't know how I imagined Mary's song, but 2 years ago, I spent a lot of intentional time in it, piecing out what are these like different elements that she's speaking to. And some of it is like, her own personal experience, but she's absolutely speaking to the destruction of the empire. Like you said, he's brought down the powerful from their thrones and has lifted up the humble. And I can't remember it exactly, but he's
hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy. I mean,
yes. And how can we prepare for Christmas without paying attention to those words? Like how if we don't pay attention to those words that are talking about the very real societal, the very real social impact that the Messiah is going to have in the here and now, our pictures of Christmas are actually pretty dim and one-sided, honestly. So much there. He's filled the hungry with good things.
Yeah, and I think I would say, especially in the context I was formed in spiritually, there was such an emphasis on the cosmic grace that would come through Jesus's life, his death on the cross, his resurrection, his ascension, but very little emphasis on what I would say is how that salvation is meant to be lived out in the here and now. The more particular, embodied, I mean, to me, that's why the story of the cross and the resurrection and ascension also need the incarnation to balance out the sense of there's a statement God is making in bringing salvation through a human being who is the embodiment of God.
Yes.
Not like these are just some side projects that are happening, for Jesus to kind of bide his time until he gets to the cross. They are the manifestation of all the law. I mean, he's the manifestation of all the law and the prophets of what it means to love. And that's a different invitation and a different orientation of what grace means in the here and now.
As you're speaking, I was thinking, when we take the Eucharist and when we see the table in Scripture and Christ says, "This is my body broken for you," for a long time, that is where it started for me. That's where my salvation started for me. Like him saying that line, "This is my body broken for you." Advent, I think, says, first a woman's body will be broken. That declaration is, it's what Christ says at that table. It's a culmination of sorts. It's not actually the origin. First, a woman's body would be broken. The hope of the world is going to rest in a woman choosing to allow her body to be broken and rended, her blood to be shed, to bring forth the Messiah who would one day be broken and bled himself. And it's a little bit of that mutuality peeking through again as we think about how salvation is actually operating and throughout the whole story of God and of us.
Mm-hmm. And that's why many people refer to Mary as the first Christian, the sense of there's something of her faithfulness to believe in the goodness of God and these promises of God against all odds, and in a way that made her life in a lot of danger in that particular context. And so we keep coming back to something of women's bodies, of mutuality, of a kind of mutual faith. So let's talk about some of the challenges of that in this particular season, because we know you've talked about trauma. You've talked on Black Liturgies. We are a center that takes trauma very seriously, takes human heartache very seriously, takes our stories and how they connect and reflect to the story of God. What are some of the ways in this season, in your body, in your imagination, in the liturgies that will come, that you're taking in? What are some of the ways we take the risks in this season to practice a different kind of mutuality, a different kind of imagination of who God is and what it means that God is coming to be with us through the womb? Because I was mentioning, and I said this last week on the podcast, I'm a very embodied woman, always have been, which means I'm well acquainted with all of the complex human emotions I feel. And this season, I feel like my cortisol has flooded so much that my body is shutting down. That's the way I think I'm feeling a need to pursue safety. And yet, I want to know, what are the things, what are the ways I get to participate in the birthing of God, in the expectant waiting of this season, which is its own kind of unique suffering, but I think it's a suffering unto joy, not in the absence of lament. Joy and sorrow are sisters in the same home. And so what are some of the ways you think we can be imagining God in this moment, embodying God in this moment?
Right. Yeah, I think apart from what we've mentioned about a little bit of, I don't know if we use the word rebellion, but this rebellion against empire, these acts of justice. Apart from that, I've been thinking of embodied practices of silence and darkness as they image the womb. And I'll start with silence. I had a student once say this to me, actually. She was preparing to give a talk on silence, and she said, when I feel insecure about what I'm asking of people, I remember that Christ was formed in silence for 9 months in the womb. And it got me thinking of like what a sacred time that was, to just like rest in quiet warmth and do nothing, at least not that we can perceive, apart from allow himself to be held and formed. And I think that speaks, holy things over the capacity for silence and stillness in our own lives. So my husband and I, we pretty much have silent mornings. We'll say the Lord's Prayer, and then we try to remain in silence for about an hour. That might not work for everyone, but and we do this sometimes together, sometimes alone, and it places us in a state where the rest that we had in the night, hopefully, can also be entered into in the day, and that we can become in tune with our bodies, with our desires, with our anxieties, with our kind of inner dialogue as we wake, that we can be in tune to that, which I think is really important. And then I think about darkness, and this is a stranger habit that our household has, is we've been trying, it's more recent, to spend one day a month without artificial light. One day every month out. And it's like really bizarre. We told a few people about it, and we're like, maybe we should stop telling people that we're doing this.
I kind of love it.
Yeah, I think, many of us haven't spent time thinking about how it forms us to be able to control light and dark. If you just bear with me for a second, but if you think back to before these technologies of modern light, I think you will see a kind of waiting, certainly a different kind of fear. Back in those times, the night brought with it very real threats of danger and threats of the unknown and the unseen. And the dawn meant something different than it does to us today. And I should be clear, I don't think it's more, holy to exist in threatening, dangerous spaces. But I do think that having that formation, that like having the practice of waiting in the dark is, and having our lives change because of the dark, and having to accommodate the darkness as well. And I think when we have practices of darkness, it allows us to say, evil doesn't get to colonize this. Most of our images of darkness are, that it's the place, it's the site of evil. And maybe that's true to some extent, but maybe that's true because of the very real potential that the darkness holds to grow beautiful things, to make miracles. And so, when I think about there's nothing wrong with turning on a light switch. I don't want to sound unrealistic, but those days that we've had where we don't have access to just flip on the light switch, I do believe that's doing something to me. And there is something that can be really healthy about submitting to like the rising and setting of the sun. And I hope that it's forming me to be one who, when fears and evils arise, that I would be one not too quick to rush toward resolution, not too quick to just turn on the light and rip either myself or my neighbor out of moments of grief and pain and loss, but to sit in them and wait. And like you said, to wait not alone, ideally, but in the presence of others.
Yeah, I love that. And I think in some ways it is the practice. I mean, there's not, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, we are in our longest nights. And the way that sunlight is working, and, the amount of time we spend away rotating from the reflection of the sun. And I think it's no surprise even that so many people are decorating for Christmas early this year. I mean, I've seen it all over Instagram, people putting up their twinkle lights. And there's something about, even if you can't go in complete darkness, there's something about people wanting the kind of low lights,
Yes.
but the twinkle of small lights that actually brings a different kind of soothing and a different invitation. And in some ways, that to me is what is so incredibly powerful about a lot of the language of the incarnation, that there's something about the coming of the dawn, in some ways, even the smallness of the light, yet that's such a paradox, right? Because the light of the womb is as bright as the cosmos. There's something so mysterious that's happening there. That does disrupt despair, because make no mistake about it, the incarnation is changing everything in the metaphysical realm. And yes, like eventually with the other stories of our gospel will continue to bring disruption to despair. But I love these embodied practices. I think about what would it look like to enter silence for a certain part of the morning with a weighted blanket, to where you're not just, because I know for myself, I've noticed, like, if I have moments of silence right now, I feel frantic. Like, I gotta be distracted. I can't handle this. There's too much happening. And what does it look like to have practices that remind us God is with us in the silence? God is with us in the darkness. And so I think these are really powerful ways to lean into some embodied practices in this season. Before we kind of move toward a close, I would love to take a moment, because one of the things you offer through your liturgies that people, again, can access on your Instagram, Black Liturgies, or find through the website, blackliturgies.com. But one of the things you often so regularly are breath prayers. And I'm wondering if you could just give a very small, like, what is a breath prayer? And potentially even guide us here on the podcast through a breath prayer that could be a really powerful practice, along with these moments of silence, along with growing a capacity to wait and anticipate light breaking in. Because I think that could be that could be another powerful, simple practice for people in this season.
Sure, I'd love to. A breath prayer, it's a practice much older than me, or you or I, but it's basically one beautiful way to have your prayer be embodied. And I think it's a kind of prayer that meets anxiety really well, that meets sadness really well, and that is short enough that you can carry it with you throughout your day. And so you inhale as you're thinking one phrase, and you exhale as you're thinking the next. And I tried to do 5 and 5, like 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. But some of you might have, better lung capacities than I. So, but I think as we do it today, let's use that framework. And this is a breath prayer that I wrote actually the day after the election, when there was just so much uncertainty and just so much in between and confusion, and it felt like, truth was far away, and I was needing to confront, harsher realities that day for sure. And so the inhale is, I grow weary of waiting. Exhale is, Lord, keep me from despair. So if you want to practice this with us where you are, just take a moment and relax the tension you're carrying in your shoulders, relax your jaw, pay attention to what hurts. And if you need to recline a little bit, do that. There's a lot of research that shows just placing your hand over your heart triggers a lot of helpful things toward calm and toward a slowness of breath. So feel the warmth of your hand and the presence of the Lord as you inhale. I grow weary of waiting. Exhale, Lord, keep me from despair. Inhale, I grow weary of waiting. Exhale, Lord, keep me from despair. And one more breath. Inhale, We grow weary of waiting. Exhale, Lord, keep us from despair. Amen.
Thank you, Cole. I'm so grateful for that. I want to just reiterate your generosity, your courage. You are one of the fiercest people I know, and you are a truth teller, but you do so with a kind of ferocious kindness. And I think it's rarely nice. And I'm so glad for that, because I think niceness is an abomination.
Thank you.
Kindness is a disruptive power of love. And I just want to say, as someone who is aware that as I take in your liturgies and have opportunity to receive them and participate in them, I do so from a different locatedness, my embodied location in the world, and that it is changing me. It's changing my imagination. It's growing a capacity for me to make room, to anticipate other people's needs differently, to encounter the kind of kindness that heaps burning coals, but yet invites me to repentance in a way that I know I'm meant for, that is its own kind of liberation. And so I want to just say thank you. Cole is also currently working on a book with Convergent Books of Penguin House. And so I don't know if you have any insight on timing of that, but that's something, if you are just encountering Cole and you're encountering her work and you're thinking, man, I would love to be able to read more, that's coming down the pipeline. And I also just want to let people know, Cole is also on Patreon. I think Black Liturgies is on Patreon. And if you're not familiar with Patreon, it's a way to support people and artists, especially ministers, in their work that allows them to keep doing this work for the people and for the common good. And it's a way you can come alongside and support. And so that's another place I would direct you. We'll try to have these resources available in the blog write-up, so that you can just click on them. But thank you again for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Rachel.
Well, I think we can say without question, this has been a year like no other year. And the level of trauma we have seen in the midst of, well, all sorts of crises. We've got a year ahead that in some ways is going to be where the effects of trauma are actually being played out in people's lives in a far more dramatic way. And as much as we have seen the goodness of God, we know that our labor ahead is going to be even more complex and frankly, even more demanding.
It really has been tremendous in the midst of such an uncharted, unprecedented time to see the provision of God, because honestly, in a year where we thought maybe we would struggle to get people to our trainings, we've had bigger waiting lists. We've had more people opting in, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So we know not only do we have tremendous work ahead, but that we want to be able to equip as many people as possible, because it really does feel like one of those seasons where the harvest is going to be really plentiful, but the workers are few. So however you might be able to partner with us and join us as we lean into the year ahead and really try to steward well the resources we've been given, the calling we've been given, and the tremendous people who have come alongside of us to live out this calling. So if you feel compelled to partner with us and give, you can go to theallendercenter.org/give. The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.